She emerged from the water naked, her skin still prickling from the cold, hair plastered to her body like a wet secret. She thought she was alone, free, wild, untouched. But then she felt it. That gaze. Hot, hungry, dangerous. She turned slowly, and the air vanished from her lungs. Thomas was there, standing like a statue of restrained desire, his eyes traveling over every curve of her body, with an intensity that burned hotter than the sun. He didn't look away. She didn't cover herself fast enough, and in that charged silence they both knew there was no going back. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was truly worth listening to, also click the Super Thanks button. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you. The limousine glided through the city streets like a silent promise, its interior lined with black leather and polished wood, exuding the unmistakable scent of luxury and power. Brianna Hayes adjusted the skirt of her grey suit, her nervous fingers smoothing the fabric over and over as she tried to ignore the magnetic presence beside her. But it was impossible. Thomas Everett occupied the space not just with his body, tall, elegant, wrapped in a navy blue suit that seemed to have been sewn directly onto his broad shoulders, but with something more dangerous, an energy that filled every inch of air between them. The silence inside the car was thick, almost tangible. It wasn't the comfortable silence of two people at ease, but that kind of charged quiet that vibrates with everything left unsaid. Brianna could feel the heat emanating from him, even with the respectful distance they maintained. The air conditioning whispered low, but it couldn't dissipate the warmth growing beneath her skin. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on his tablet, his fingers sliding across the screen with calculated precision, but Brianna knew with that feminine intuition that needs no proof that he was aware of her every move, every time she crossed her legs, every discreet sigh, every beat of her heart that seemed to echo too loudly in that confined space. She looked out the window, watching the city transform into highway, then into dense vegetation. The corporate retreat was 3 hours away, hidden in the mountains like a well-kept secret. 3 hours beside him. 3 hours trying not to think about how his voice affected her when he said her name in meetings. 3 hours pretending she didn't feel that knot in her stomach every time he entered a room. "Are you comfortable?" Thomas's voice cut through the silence like a velvet blade. Brianna turned slowly, meeting those grey-blue eyes that seemed to see right through the masks she wore. He hadn't looked up from his tablet, but there was something in the tilt of his head, in the almost imperceptible tension of his jaw, that revealed his complete awareness of her. "Yes? Thank you." Her voice came out lower than intended, almost too intimate for a conversation between boss and subordinate. He finally looked at her. It was just a second, maybe two, but it was enough to make the entire world seem to tilt on its axis. His eyes didn't just see her. They devoured her with a restrained, civilized, but undeniably ravenous hunger. They traveled over her face as if memorizing every detail, the curve of her lips, the arch of her eyebrows, the quickened pulse visible at her neck. Good. He returned to his tablet, but the ghost of that look remained on her skin like a caress that never came. Brianna felt the flush rise up her neck. She turned back to the window, but no longer saw the landscape. She only saw his reflection in the dark glass, the strong line of his jaw, lips that seemed made to speak dangerous promises, those large, confident hands on the tablet, hands she had already imagined. She shook her head discreetly, pushing away thoughts she shouldn't be having. But he seemed to have the gift of making it impossible not to think. Every movement was calculated, elegant, masculine in a way that didn't need to try. When he crossed his legs, the fabric of his pants stretched over his muscular thigh, and Brianna looked away too quickly not to be noticed. "Have you been to the retreat before?" Thomas asked, his voice too casual to be truly casual. "No, it's my first time. You'll like it. It's isolated, wild, far from everything." He paused, and she felt the weight of those words in a way she couldn't explain. Sometimes that's exactly what we need. Distance from the rules, from the office, from expectations. Her heart gave a dangerous leap. There was something between the lines there, something that made her entire body go on alert. She risked looking at him again and found him watching her through the window's reflection, exactly as she had been doing with him moments before. Their gazes met in the glass, and for an instant neither looked away. It was a game. Silent. Dangerous. Delicious. Expectations can be suffocating, she heard herself say, surprised by her own courage. His lips curved into a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes, but sent a wave of heat straight to the center of her body. They can be, especially when we know exactly what we want, but all the rules say we can't have it. The air grew even thicker. Brianna felt her mouth go dry. Was he talking about work? About corporate goals? Or was there something more in those carefully chosen words? The driver announced they would arrive in an hour. 1 hour, 60 minutes, 3,600 seconds of mounting tension. Thomas closed his tablet with a soft click and leaned forward slightly, reaching for a bottle of water. The movement made his scent, something woody mixed with a fresh note of mint, reach Brianna like an invisible wave. She breathed deeply without thinking, and he noticed, of course he noticed. Water. He offered her a bottle, and when she reached out to take it, their fingers touched. It was brief, accidental, but the electricity that ran up her arm was anything but accidental. She saw his pupils dilate, saw the way his breathing became slightly deeper. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice betraying the chaos she felt inside. He didn't respond, just nodded, but continued holding the bottle a second longer than necessary, forcing her fingers to remain touching his. When he finally let go, Brianna felt the absence of that touch, like a physical loss. She drank the water, trying to use the cold to calm the heat growing under her skin, but it didn't help. Every cell in her body was hyper-aware of him, of the sound of his breathing, of the way he ran his hand through his dark hair, messing it up in a way that made him less impeccable CEO and more dangerously attractive man. Brianna. Her name in his voice was pure sin. She turned, finding him looking directly at her now, without the safety of the reflection, without masks. "I hope you enjoy the retreat. You deserve it. You've worked hard this year." There was something more in that. Something in the intensity of his gaze, in the lower tone of his voice, in the way he said deserve that sounded almost like desire. "I'll try," she managed to respond, though her mind was screaming other things. Things a marketing assistant shouldn't think about her CEO. But when he smiled, a small, intimate smile just for her, Brianna knew she was lost. The rest of the trip passed in a fog of mounting tension. Words were exchanged, polite and professional on the surface, but each one loaded with dangerous undercurrents. When they finally arrived at the resort, surrounded by green-covered mountains and the distant sound of running water, Thomas got out first and extended his hand to help her. Brianna hesitated just a second before accepting. His hand was warm, strong, enveloping hers in a way that felt far more intimate than the gesture required. He pulled her gently, and for a moment they stood very close, body nearly touching body, breaths mingling. "Welcome," he murmured, so low that only she could hear. And as she entered the resort, still feeling the warmth of that hand in hers, Brianna knew that something had begun in that limousine, something neither of them would be able to stop. The first day of the corporate retreat was refined torture disguised as professional networking. Brianna survived the endless introductions, the too firm handshakes, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes of executives silently competing with each other. But what truly consumed her was Thomas's constant presence, always nearby, always watching, always making her body react in ways she couldn't control. During lunch, he sat 3 chairs to her left. He didn't look directly at her once, but Brianna felt every moment his attention turned in her direction, as if her body had developed an exclusive radar for him. When she laughed at another colleague's comment, she noticed his jaw tighten slightly. When she picked up her wineglass, she saw his eyes follow the movement to her lips. It was a dangerous game they were playing, and no one else at the table seemed to notice. In the afternoon, during the lecture on strategic leadership, Thomas stood at the front of the room, commanding everyone's attention with that magnetic presence that made him impossible to ignore. But for Brianna, every word that came from that mouth was sweet torment. She tried to focus on the content, on the market strategies, on the graphs projected on the screen. But all she could see was the way his lips moved, how his hands gestured with precision, how that deep voice vibrated inside her chest like a note played directly on her soul. When the lecture ended and everyone stood for the break, Thomas walked past her. Their shoulders touched, a brief brush, apparently accidental. But the look he cast over his shoulder, that half-second of intense connection, said everything. It wasn't an accident. Brianna needed air. She needed to escape that suffocating hall where his scent still hung in the air, where every breath seemed loaded with an unspoken promise. She needed to get away before she did something reckless. When the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, she finally found her excuse. She told her colleagues she wanted to explore the trails before dinner, ignored the invitations to happy hour in the lounge, and headed in the opposite direction from where she knew Thomas would be. The forest welcomed her like an old friend. The air was different there, cooler, scented with moss and damp earth, free from the artificial tension of the resort. Brianna followed a narrow trail, her sneakers sinking slightly into the soft ground covered with leaves. With each step, she felt the weight of the day dissolving, replaced by something more primal, more true, and then she heard it. The sound of running water, distant but unmistakable. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with an inexplicable excitement. She followed the sound as if under a spell, dodging low branches, her hands brushing the rough bark of ancient trees. The vegetation grew denser, wilder, until suddenly it opened into a hidden clearing. The waterfall was there, cascading from black rocks covered in emerald-green moss, creating a natural pool of crystalline water that sparkled under the last rays of sun. It was a place forgotten by time, untouched, sacred in its raw beauty. Brianna stopped at the edge, mesmerized. The sound of the water was like a song, enveloping her, calling to her. The heat of the day still clung to her skin, and the sight of that cool water was a temptation impossible to resist. She looked around. Nothing but dense forest and silence. She was completely alone. Her heart beat faster, not with nervousness, but with a growing boldness she didn't know she possessed. Without overthinking, because overthinking would ruin the magic of this moment, Brianna began to remove her clothes. First the blazer, carefully folded and placed on a smooth stone. Then the blouse, revealing pale skin that rarely saw the sun. The bra was harder, her fingers trembling slightly as she unhooked it, not from cold, but from pure adrenaline. When she finally freed herself from it, she felt the air touch her bare skin like a forbidden caress. The pants came next, sliding down her legs until she stood only in her underwear. She hesitated for a moment, a last vestige of civilization trying to keep her bound to the rules. But then she thought of Thomas, of his look in that limousine, of the tension she'd been carrying for months, and something inside her broke. She was completely naked. The vulnerability was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Every inch of her skin was exposed to the world, to the air, to the wild nature surrounding her. And for the first time in a long time, Brianna felt truly alive. She walked to the edge of the natural pool, her feet touching the icy water that made her entire body shiver. She didn't pull back. Instead, she entered slowly, each step a surrender, until the water reached her knees, then her thighs, then her waist. When she finally submerged completely, the shock of the cold stole her breath. She emerged with a sigh that was almost a moan, hair plastered to her face and neck, water streaming between her breasts, down her stomach, down her back. She had never felt so naked, so exposed, so absolutely free. She swam to the waterfall, letting the water fall over her head, massaging her tense shoulders with a force that seemed to wash away, not just the day's grime, but all the worries, all the rules, all the expectations she carried like invisible armor. She closed her eyes, tilted her head back, and for the first time since entering that limousine beside Thomas, she could breathe without feeling her chest tighten. The world stopped. The office no longer existed, urgent emails didn't exist, corporate hierarchies didn't exist. There was only her, the water, the forest, and that feeling of pure, unbridled freedom. Brianna didn't know how long she stayed there, lost in that trance. It could have been minutes or hours. Time meant nothing in that forgotten place. Finally, when she felt her fingers begin to wrinkle and the air grow colder as the sun set completely, she decided it was time to go back. She swam to the shore, emerging slowly, water streaming down her body in silver rivulets that caught the last rays of light. She stood there for a moment, naked and wet, her back to the forest, looking at the waterfall as if etching that moment into her memory. She wanted to remember this feeling forever. Of the brave woman she had become, even if only for a few minutes. This was the woman Thomas saw when he looked at her that way. The woman she hid beneath formal suits and impeccable professional behavior. The woman who desired things she shouldn't desire. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the forest's pure air, feeling every fiber of her body vibrate with life. She was ready to turn around, to get dressed and return to the real world. But then she felt it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement. It was something more primal, that instinctive awareness that she was no longer alone, that she was being watched. Her heart raced, pounding so loudly it seemed to echo through the clearing. The skin that moments before had been warm with freedom now prickled with something else, something more dangerous, something more intense. She knew, even before turning around. She knew by the way the air changed. She knew by the way every nerve ending in her body awakened at once. She knew by the way desire, that desire she'd been fighting for months, exploded in her chest like a rocket. Thomas was there. Time froze. Brianna turned slowly, every movement seeming to happen in slow motion, as if the universe had decided to prolong that moment of pure vulnerability. Water still streamed down her naked body, forming silver trails over skin gilded by the last ray of sun that managed to penetrate through the trees. Her hair was plastered to her shoulders, to her breasts, drops suspended at the tips like tiny liquid diamonds. And then her eyes met his. Thomas stood at the edge of the clearing, about 10 meters away, completely motionless, not like someone who had just arrived and was processing the scene, but like someone who had been there long enough to have seen everything, to have absorbed every second of that stolen intimacy. The navy blue suit was slightly wrinkled, as if he'd walked hurriedly through the forest. His tie had been loosened, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone, revealing the base of his neck, where she could see his quickened pulse. His hair, always perfectly combed, was slightly disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it several times. But it was his eyes that killed her. Those grey-blue eyes she knew as professional and controlled now burned with something completely different. Hunger. Pure, unfiltered desire. They travelled over her body with a deliberate slowness that was more intimate than any physical touch, starting with her flushed face, moving down her neck where her pulse beat out of control, over her bare shoulders, over breasts she couldn't completely cover with her arms, the curve of her waist, her hips, her thighs still wet. This wasn't the quick, embarrassed glance of someone who'd accidentally stumbled upon a private scene. It was the look of a man drinking in the sight of her, as if it were the last drop of water in the desert, as if he'd waited his entire life for this moment, and now that he had it, he refused to waste it by looking away. "Thomas?" Brianna's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, broken, loaded with a mixture of shock, shame, and something darker she didn't want to name. His name on her lips seemed to break the trance. He blinked, his jaw visibly clenching, the muscles in his neck tensing as if he were waging a war with himself. But even so, he didn't look away. Not immediately. "Brianna." His voice came out deep, hoarse, scraping like sandpaper over velvet. There was an intensity there that made her stomach knot. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't embarrassment. It was acknowledgement. As if he were saying her name for the first time, tasting the sound of it on his tongue, marking this moment as the watershed between before and after. She should scream. She should demand he turn around. She should dive back into the water to hide. But she was paralyzed, trapped in that gaze that held her more firmly than any pair of hands ever could. Thomas began, his voice faltering for the first time since Brianna had known him. The man who commanded boardrooms with international CEOs, who never wavered in million-dollar negotiations, was struggling to form a simple sentence. "I didn't know you were here." But there was something in the way he said it, with his eyes still fixed on her, with his breathing still irregular, that turned the words into a lie. Or maybe not a complete lie, but a half-truth. Maybe he didn't know initially, but the moment he discovered it, he couldn't walk away. "Please." Brianna finally managed to move her arms, crossing them over her breasts in a futile attempt to recover some vestige of dignity. "Turn around," he obeyed. But not immediately. There was a pause of 2-3 seconds, where his eyes lingered on her face, memorizing, recording, as if he wanted to make sure he'd remember exactly how she looked in that moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he turned his back. But the image was already burned between them, irreversible, impossible to unsee. Brianna ran to her clothes, her heart pounding so hard it seemed to want to leap from her chest. Her hands trembled violently as she tried to grab her underwear, almost dropping it twice. The dampness of her body made everything harder. The fabric stuck to her wet skin, refusing to cooperate. Behind her she could hear Thomas's breathing, deep, too controlled to be natural, as if he were counting each inhale, each exhale, fighting for control. "I came looking for you," he said suddenly, his voice still tense, still hoarse. "I noticed you left alone. I don't know what I thought. That you might be lost. That you might need—" He stopped, and she could feel the frustration in the pause. "I'm sorry. I should have announced my presence as soon as I saw you. I should have turned around immediately." "Why didn't you?" The words came out before Brianna could stop them, loaded with a boldness that surprised her. The silence that followed was deafening. She managed to put on her underwear and was struggling with her bra, the clasps refusing to click into place with her still trembling fingers. She could see his broad back, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Because," he began, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it over the sound of the waterfall, "for the first time in my life, I couldn't do what was right." The air left her lungs. The bra finally closed, but her hand stopped mid-motion as she reached for her blouse. That confession, so raw, so honest, so dangerous, hung between them like smoke. "Thomas," she began, not knowing what she would say next. "You were free," he continued, still with his back turned, as if the words were being torn from him against his will. "Completely free, without masks, without walls. And he breathed deeply, his shoulders rising and falling. "I couldn't look away from something so true." Brianna put on her blouse with automatic movements, then her pants, but each piece of clothing only seemed to emphasize what had happened, that she had been naked before him, that he had seen her, that something between them had changed irrevocably. "You can turn around," she finally said, her own voice strangely calm despite the internal chaos. Thomas turned slowly. The look that met hers was different now, still intense, still loaded with desire but also vulnerable in a way she'd never seen, as if he'd removed his own armor along with the professional gaze he always maintained. "Brianna, He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if there were an invisible barrier he didn't have permission to cross. "I need you to know that I would never do anything to make you uncomfortable. I would never use my position to—" "I know," she interrupted him, because she did know. Despite everything, despite the absurdity of this situation, she knew Thomas Everett wasn't that kind of man. He ran his hand through his hair, messing it up even more, a gesture of frustration that made him less unreachable CEO and more human, more real, more dangerous to her heart. "We should go back," Brianna said, though every fiber of her body screamed the opposite. "They'll notice we're gone." "Yes." He agreed, but neither of them moved. The clearing seemed to envelop them in a bubble of suspended time. The sound of the waterfall continued its eternal song, indifferent to the moment it was witnessing. The shadows grew longer with the setting sun, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Brianna, her name again, but this time it sounded different, like a prayer, like a promise, like a question he didn't know how to formulate. "Yes, what I saw here." He paused, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that cut to the soul. "It wasn't just your body, it was you, the woman you hide beneath the suits and perfect presentations, the woman who—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, I've already said too much." But he hadn't said enough, and they both knew it. The silence between them now was different from the silence in the limousine. It was no longer unacknowledged tension. It was mutual recognition of something that could no longer be ignored. "We really should go back," she repeated, more firmly this time, because if they stayed there one more minute, if he kept looking at her that way, she would do something unthinkable. Thomas nodded, the movement stiff, controlled. "You go first. I'll wait a few minutes, so that they don't make connections," she finished for him. "Exactly." Brianna began walking toward the trail, each step feeling wrong, as if she were leaving something essential behind. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she couldn't resist. She turned to look at him one more time. He stood exactly where she'd left him, but his eyes followed her with that same controlled hunger. And in that moment, under the last ray of sun touching his face, Brianna saw the naked truth written there. He wanted her as much as she wanted him. And that truth was more terrifying than anything they had said. The walk back was silent torture. Brianna led the way, her steps too hurried to be casual, her heart still beating in a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with the physical effort of the walk. The forest that minutes before had welcomed her as a sanctuary now seemed to conspire against her. Every branch that brushed her arm was a reminder of how she'd felt naked under that gaze. Every breeze that touched her still damp skin was an echo of the shiver that had run through her body when he'd said her name. Behind her, at a carefully calculated distance of a few meters, Thomas walked in silence. But Brianna could feel his presence like a magnetic force, pulling her back even as her feet pushed her forward. She could hear the sound of his footsteps crushing dry leaves, breathing too controlled, the rustling of his suit against the branches. And more intense than all of that, she could feel his eyes on her back. It wasn't her imagination. She knew, the same way she'd known he was in the clearing before she even turned around. There was a connection established between them now, an invisible thread that vibrated every time his eyes landed on her. And in that moment, that thread was stretched so tight it seemed about to snap. Brianna tried to focus on the path, on the loose stones that could make her stumble, on the increasingly dim light that made the trail treacherous. But all she could think about was the way he'd looked at her, the raw, unfiltered hunger in those eyes, the hoarse confession that he couldn't do what was right. Her clothes stuck to her still damp body, the fabric of her blouse clinging to her breasts in a way that made her painfully aware of every movement. She should have dried herself better, should have waited. But she'd been so desperate to cover her nakedness, to regain some control of the situation, that she'd simply put everything on over her wet skin. Now she regretted it, because the damp fabric traced every curve, every line of her body, with a precision that was perhaps even more provocative than nudity. And Thomas saw it. She knew he saw it. Brianna. His voice cut through the silence like a heated blade. She stopped, her heart racing again. She didn't turn around. She didn't trust herself to turn and face him in that moment. Stop for a moment. Please. There was something in his voice, a tension, a contained urgency, that made her entire body tremble. Slowly, forcing herself to breathe, she turned around. Thomas was closer than she thought, just a meter away, close enough for her to see the drops of sweat at his temple, close enough to feel the heat emanating from that large body. His eyes traveled over her face, down her neck, and she saw the exact moment he realized. The damp blouse, the outline of her breasts too visible, her nipples showing against the wet fabric. His jaw clenched so hard she heard his teeth grind. "You're shaking," he said, his voice hoarse, fighting for normalcy and failing miserably. "I'm fine," she lied, crossing her arms over her chest in a futile attempt to hide. "You're not." He took a step forward, and suddenly the space between them vanished, until only that charged, vibrant air remained, thick with everything they weren't saying. "You're shaking from cold or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew it wasn't cold making her shake. Before Brianna could protest, Thomas removed his suit jacket with a fluid movement and wrapped it around her shoulders. The fabric still carried the warmth of his body, the woody scent that had haunted her for months. It was like being enveloped by him, by his essence. "Thomas, you don't need to—" "I do." He adjusted the jacket over her, his hands brushing her shoulders, the touch lasting half a second longer than necessary. His fingers burned through the fabric. "I can't let you go back like this. They'll ask questions." His hands were still on her shoulders, holding the jacket's lapels as if he needed an excuse to keep them there. Brianna looked up, meeting those grey-blue eyes, so close now that she could see the tones of silver and navy mixed together, like a stormy ocean. "And do you care?" she heard herself ask, her voice coming out more defiant than intended. "What people will think?" Something passed across his face, surprise perhaps, or admiration for her boldness. His hands tightened on her shoulders, his fingers pressing in slightly, marking her. "I should care," he responded, his voice low, intimate, vibrating between them. "I should care about company policies, about hierarchies, about what would be said if anyone knew that I—" He stopped, his breathing growing heavier. "That I haven't been able to get you out of my head for months." The world tilted. Brianna felt her knees weaken, and if it weren't for his hands holding her, she would have staggered. "Thomas, do you know how many nights I lie awake?" He continued, the words pouring out now as if a dam had broken. "How many meetings where I watch you talk and don't hear a word because I'm lost in the way your mouth moves? How many times I've had to force myself to leave the room because being near you was driving me crazy?" Each confession was like liquid fire in her veins. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because—" He took another step, and now they were body against body, his chest touching hers with each breath. "After today, after seeing you like that, free, wild, absolutely perfect, I can't pretend anymore that this is just professional admiration." His hands moved from her shoulders to her neck, his thumbs brushing the line of her jaw with a reverence that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. It was a light touch, almost hesitant, but loaded with such desire that Brianna felt her legs turn to liquid. "I shouldn't be touching you like this," he whispered, but his fingers traced the contour of her face, as if memorizing every angle. "Shouldn't be this close. But at the waterfall, when you emerged from the water—" He closed his eyes for a second as if the memory were too painful. "I saw something I'll never forget. Not just beauty, but courage, freedom, truth. Thomas, we can't—" she began, but her voice failed when his thumb brushed her lower lip. "I know." His eyes opened, fixing on hers with an intensity that burned her from the inside. "I know all the reasons why this is impossible. I know I'm your boss. I know the rules. I know the consequences." He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. "But knowing that doesn't change the fact that I want you in a way that scares me." Brianna's heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it. Every inch of skin where he touched her seemed to be on fire. "You're scaring me too." "Afraid of me?" he asked, his voice suddenly vulnerable. "No." She raised her hands, hesitant, until her palms rested on his chest. She felt his heart beating wildly under his shirt as fast as hers. "Afraid of what I'll do, of what I'll want, of what I already want." His eyes darkened, pupils dilating until they almost swallowed the grey-blue. "And what do you want?" It was a dangerous question, a question that, if answered honestly, would change everything. Brianna knew she should lie, should back away, should remember all the sensible reasons why this was a terrible idea. But instead she leaned forward, eliminating the last inches between them until her lips brushed his ear. "I want you to really touch me." She felt his entire body stiffen, a tremor running through him from top to bottom. His hands on her face tightened, fingers sinking into her still damp hair. He turned his face, his lips so close to hers that their breaths mingled. "If I really touch you," he murmured, his voice so hoarse it was almost a growl, "I won't be able to stop." "Then don't stop." For one infinite second, he was completely motionless, locked between desire and control. Brianna could see the war happening behind those eyes. Responsibility against passion, duty against desire. Then, something broke. His hands slid from her face to the nape of her neck, fingers sinking into her wet hair with a possessiveness that made her gasp. But he didn't kiss her. Instead, he pulled her against him with a force that stole her breath, enveloping her completely, his large body eclipsing hers. "God, Brianna," he murmured against her hair, his voice broken. "You have no idea what you do to me." His hands traveled down her back over the jacket, down the curve of her waist, up again, as if he needed to touch every inch of her to prove she was real. It wasn't sexual. It was deeper than that. It was need. It was recognition. It was surrender. Brianna clung to his shirt, her fingers gripping the fabric as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling. She could feel his heat through all the layers of clothing, his heart beating against hers in a chaotic and perfect rhythm. "We need to go back," he said against her hair, but his hands held her tighter, contradicting the words. "I know. They'll notice. I know. This can't happen again. I know." But neither of them let go. They stood there, embraced in the growing darkness of the forest, two bodies fighting against the reality that awaited them outside. When they finally separated, it was slow, reluctant, as if each inch of distance caused physical pain. Thomas held her face once more, his eyes traveling over every feature as if memorizing. "This changes everything," he whispered. "I know." And as they resumed the path back, maintaining the respectful distance that circumstances demanded, both carried the burning truth. Nothing would be the same as before. The silent game was over. Now it was only fire. Morning arrived mercilessly, bringing with it the reality Brianna had managed to postpone during her sleepless night. She looked at herself in the bedroom mirror, observing the discreet dark circles that not even makeup could completely hide. She'd spent hours lying in bed, reliving every second at the waterfall, every word whispered in the forest, every touch that still burned on her skin like an invisible mark. Thomas's jacket was carefully hung on a chair. She would return it today. She had to return it. But the idea of handing it over, of losing that last physical trace of what had happened, made her chest tighten in an irrational way. She dressed with extra care that morning, a navy blue dress that was professional but feminine, that hugged her curves without being provocative. She pulled her hair into an elegant bun, leaving just a few loose strands framing her face. She needed to be impeccable. She needed the armor. Because today she would have to face him in front of everyone. The breakfast room was packed when Brianna arrived. Executives in their impeccable suits, animated conversations about market projections and expansion strategies, the smell of strong coffee mixed with fresh croissants. A perfect corporate scene where everyone wore their professional masks with mastery. And then she saw him. Thomas stood at the center of a group of senior executives, a coffee cup in his hand, his charcoal gray suit making him look even more imposing under the natural light streaming through the large windows. He laughed at some comment, that polite, controlled smile she knew so well from board meetings, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't seen her naked, as if he hadn't held her against his body in the darkness of the forest, as if he hadn't confessed that he wanted her in a way that scared him. The mask was back. Perfect, impenetrable. Brianna felt something tighten in her chest, disappointment perhaps, or fear that it had all been just a moment of weakness he now regretted. She breathed deeply, adjusted her posture and walked toward the buffet with a confidence she didn't feel. That's when it happened. Thomas turned his head, and his eyes met hers across the room. The world stopped. It wasn't a casual glance. It was recognition. It was hunger disguised as politeness. It was a silent promise that nothing, absolutely nothing, had changed, despite the masks they both now wore. It lasted only 2 seconds, maybe 3. But it was enough time for Brianna to feel heat rise up her neck, for her heart to race, for every nerve ending to wake up remembering exactly what it had been like to be in his arms. Then he looked away, returning to the conversation as if nothing had happened. But Brianna saw it, the way his fingers gripped the cup a little tighter, the tense line of his jaw, the breath that became imperceptibly deeper. He was fighting just as much as she was. "Brianna!" Sarah's cheerful voice from the marketing team pulled her from her trance. "Come join us. We were just discussing today's presentation." Brianna forced a smile, grabbed a cup of coffee she didn't want, and joined the group of colleagues at a table near the window. But even as she participated in the conversation, even as she laughed at the right moments and offered insights about the campaign, part of her remained hyper-aware of Thomas's every movement on the other side of the room. And he was equally aware of her. She knew it in the way he never positioned himself with his back to where she was, in the way his eyes occasionally drifted in her direction, when he thought no one would notice, in the way his posture became more rigid each time a male colleague leaned too close to her in conversation. Breakfast transformed into a carefully choreographed dance. They circled the room in calculated orbits, never too close, never completely ignoring each other's presence. It was torture and ecstasy at the same time. "Impressive how focused Thomas is today," Marcus, one of the senior managers, commented beside Brianna. "Usually he's more accessible at these events. Today he's impenetrable." Brianna took a sip of coffee to hide any reaction. Maybe he's worried about the presentations. Maybe. Marcus studied her with curiosity. Or maybe he's distracted by something more interesting. Before Brianna could respond, a deep voice cut through the buzz of conversations. "Good morning, everyone." Thomas had positioned himself at the front of the room, commanding instant attention without needing to raise his voice. Everyone turned to him, including Brianna, who felt her heart accelerate just from hearing him speak. "I'd like to begin by reiterating the importance of today's presentations. Each of you was chosen to be here because you represent the future of this company." His eyes traveled around the room, professional and distant, briefly touching each person. When they reached Brianna, there was a microscopic pause, so brief no one else would notice, but for her it was like being touched. A shiver ran down her spine. "Particularly," he continued, and Brianna realized he was still looking at her, "I'm looking forward to seeing the rebranding campaign our marketing team developed. Brianna Hayes will lead that presentation this afternoon." The sound of her own name in his voice, pronounced that way, professional on the surface but loaded with undercurrents only she could hear, made her stomach knot. All eyes turned to her. Brianna forced a confident smile, nodding in his direction. "It will be my pleasure to present the team's work, Mr. Everett." Mr. Everett. The formality sounded absurd after everything, but it was necessary. It was the mask. "I'm sure it will be exceptional," he responded, his voice maintaining that perfect professional tone. But his eyes said something else. They said he remembered every second, that he was fighting as much as she was, that this was delicious hell. The meeting continued, but Brianna could barely concentrate. She was painfully aware of every time Thomas spoke, every movement he made, every rare moment when their gazes crossed through the room like electric shocks disguised as casualness. When everyone began to disperse for the morning's activities, Brianna stood too quickly, almost knocking over her cup. She needed to get out of there. She needed air. She needed distance from him before she did something reckless. "Ms. Hayes." His voice reached her when she was almost at the door. "A moment, please." Brianna froze, her heart racing. She turned slowly. Thomas was a few meters away, but other colleagues still circulated nearby, making any private conversation impossible. "Yes, Mr. Everett?" Her voice came out surprisingly steady. He approached, stopping at a professionally appropriate distance, but close enough for her to smell his scent, that woody aroma now permanently associated with the heat of his body against hers. "Your jacket," he said calmly, but there was something in the intensity of his gaze that transformed the simple words into something loaded. "I believe you still have it." "I do. I'll return it to your room later." "There's no rush." His eyes lingered on her face, briefly dropping to her lips before returning. "Take all the time you need." There were layers in that, layers no one else would perceive, but that were crystal clear to her. He was saying something more. He was saying he wasn't in a hurry, that he wanted her to keep a part of him a little longer. "About your presentation this afternoon," he continued, and now his voice was purely professional, conscious of the ears around them. "I'd like to review it with you beforehand. Let's say 2 o'clock? There's a conference room on the 3rd floor that will be empty." Brianna's heart gave a dangerous leap. A private meeting, alone, after everything that had happened. "Of course," she agreed, keeping her voice neutral. 2 o'clock. Good. He nodded, professional, controlled. But when he turned to leave, his fingers brushed hers. So briefly it could have been an accident, but they both knew it wasn't. That light touch burned more than any embrace. Brianna spent the rest of the morning in a fog of anticipation and nervousness. She participated in team dynamics, contributed to discussions about market strategies, even had lunch with colleagues on the terrace overlooking the mountains. But every second was just a countdown, 2 o'clock. He'd said 2 o'clock. When the clock finally struck 1:55, Brianna quietly excused herself and headed toward the 3rd floor. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain anyone who passed her could hear it. The conference room was at the end of a quiet hallway, far from the main areas. She stopped in front of the door, her hand hesitating over the handle. She could still go back. She could still send a message saying she needed more time to prepare the presentation, but she wasn't going to do that. She took a deep breath and opened the door. Thomas stood by the window, his back to her, hands in his pockets. The sunlight outlined his silhouette, highlighting his broad shoulders, his upright posture. He didn't turn immediately, but she saw his shoulders tense when he heard the door close. "Did you lock it?" His voice was low, controlled, but with an undercurrent of something darker. Brianna looked at the door, then back at him. Slowly, deliberately, she turned the lock. The click echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. Only then did he turn around, and the look that met her had nothing professional about it. The silence in the room was deafening. Thomas watched her with that intensity Brianna already knew, the kind that made her entire body awaken, that transformed the air into something dense and difficult to breathe. But there was something different now, something more dangerous, because they were no longer in the forest, protected by darkness and chance. They were here consciously behind a locked door, without excuses or accidents to justify what was about to happen. "You came," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was acknowledgement, perhaps even relief. "You knew I would come." Brianna took a few steps into the room but kept her distance, as if there were an invisible line that once crossed would allow no return. "I hoped." He leaned against the conference table, his hands gripping the edge hard enough to make his knuckles white. "But I wasn't sure. I thought maybe, after a night to think, you'd realize it would be wiser to avoid this." "And you?" she challenged, feeling a courage grow inside her that she didn't know she possessed. "Did you spend the night thinking too?" His eyes darkened. "I didn't sleep." "Neither did I." The confession hung between them like a spark about to ignite everything. Thomas ran his hand through his hair, that gesture of frustration she was beginning to recognize, that made him less untouchable and more human. "I tried to convince myself," he began, his voice hoarse, "that it was just admiration, professional respect for your competence, for the way you lead projects, for your undeniable talent." He paused, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that cut deep. "I lied to myself for months, because it was easier, because it was safer." Brianna took another step, then another, approaching slowly as if approaching something wild that could flee at any moment. "And now?" "Now?" He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "After yesterday, after seeing you at the waterfall." He closed his eyes as if the memory were physically painful. "I saw you free, completely free, without the armor we wear in that office, without fear, without shame, just you. And I knew I couldn't go back to before. I couldn't pretend anymore." Each word was like liquid fire in her veins. Brianna was only 2 meters from him now, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the conflict in his eyes, the way his chest rose and fell in a breath, not as controlled as he'd like. "Thomas." His name came out like a sigh, loaded with everything she didn't know how to express. "Tell me to stop," he pleaded, and there was almost desperation in that voice. "Tell me this is a terrible idea, that it will destroy us, that it will destroy your career. Tell me all the sensible things I should be saying to you. What if I don't want you to stop?" He visibly trembled, his hands gripping the table's edge even tighter. "Brianna, you need to understand what's at stake. I'm your boss. There's a hierarchy, company policies, consequences that—" "I know all that," she interrupted him, taking another step, eliminating almost all the distance between them. "I know all the logical reasons why we should leave this room now and pretend nothing happened. I know this could complicate everything. I know it's risky, and probably reckless." She stopped directly in front of him, so close she could feel the heat emanating from his body. "But I spent a sleepless night, Thomas, thinking about all the sensible reasons why I should forget you, and none of them were strong enough." His eyes widened, his breathing becoming visibly heavier. For a moment he just looked at her, as if etching that instant into his memory. The way she stood in front of him, defiant and vulnerable at the same time, admitting something that would change everything between them. "You have no idea," he said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper, "how much time I've spent trying not to think about you that way. How many meetings where I forced my mind to focus on numbers and strategies, when all I wanted was to watch the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating. How many times I had to leave the room because being near you was making me lose the control I'd built over years." He straightened, leaving the table's support, and suddenly he was in front of her, so close their bodies almost touched. Brianna had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, and even that simple movement seemed too intimate. "I tried to keep my distance," he continued, the words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "I tried to be professional, cold even. I thought if I built walls high enough, this hunger for you would simply disappear." He raised one hand, hesitant, his fingers hovering inches from her face without touching. "But yesterday, when you came out of that water, when our eyes met and I saw that you felt the same." "Thomas," she covered his hand with hers, guiding it to her face, pressing the warm palm against her cheek. The touch sent a wave of heat through her entire body. "Stop fighting." He trembled under her touch, his eyes closing for a second as if savoring the sensation. When he opened them again, there was surrender there. Surrender mixed with desire so intense it stole her breath. "If I stop fighting," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes, "there's no going back. I know. They'll find out. Eventually they'll know. I know. Your career could be affected. People will talk. They'll question every promotion, every project I give you. I know." She emphasized each word, her own fingers rising to touch his face, feeling the stubble gently scratching her fingertips. "And still, I'm here, behind a locked door, with you." Something broke in him. She saw the exact moment resistance crumbled. His hands moved from her face to her hair, sinking into the strands still pinned in the bun, pulling gently until they cascaded over her shoulders. "God, Brianna," he murmured, his fingers getting lost in her hair, gently massaging her scalp in a way that almost made her eyes close with pleasure. "You're so beautiful it hurts to look at you." She leaned into the touch, his hands now molding her face, his thumbs tracing her lips with torturous slowness. "Thomas, I want to kiss you," he confessed, his voice hoarse with barely contained desire. "I want to kiss you so badly I'm shaking." "Then why don't you?" "Because," he pressed his forehead to hers, their breaths mingling in the minimal space between them, "once I start, I won't want to stop. And we're in a conference room, in the middle of a corporate retreat, with 40 executives 2 floors away." Brianna smiled, a small mischievous smile that she saw reflected in the darkening of his eyes. "Then we'll have to be quiet." He groaned low, a sound from his throat that was pure frustration mixed with desire. "You're going to kill me. Or make you feel alive for the first time." She echoed the words he'd said in the forest, and saw recognition flare in his eyes. His hands slid from her face to her neck, his thumbs feeling her racing pulse, then down her shoulders, her arms, until he held her hands. He intertwined his fingers with hers, squeezing with a force that was almost desperate. "Before we do this," he said, forcing himself to maintain some vestige of rationality, "you need to understand, it's not just physical for me. It's not just desire. It's you, the woman you are, your brilliant mind, your courage, the way you light up a room just by entering it." He lifted one of their intertwined hands, kissing her fingers with a tenderness that contrasted with the intensity of the moment. "I don't just want your body, Brianna. I want you. All of you." Tears burned in her eyes, not from sadness, but from something deeper. Recognition, relief, pure joy at finally hearing aloud what she felt but was afraid to name. "Me too," she whispered. "It's not just attraction. It's you. The way you lead with integrity, how you challenge everyone to be better, how you carry the weight of immense responsibilities, but still find time to remember employees' birthdays." She smiled through unshed tears. "You see me, Thomas, not just as an employee or a number on the payroll. You see me. I always have," he confessed, pulling her closer until their bodies finally touched, fitting together perfectly like puzzle pieces. From the first day you walked into that office, I saw you. And then, finally, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't hesitant. It was months of accumulated tension exploding in one moment. Hungry lips, desperate hands, bodies pressing against each other as if trying to fuse. The kiss held hunger and tenderness, passion and promise, desire and something deeper that neither was ready to name. Brianna clung to his shoulders, feeling the tense muscles under his shirt, while his hands wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer and closer. When he deepened the kiss, exploring her mouth with an intimacy that made her knees weaken, she moaned softly against his lips. He pulled back just enough to whisper, "Quiet, remember." But there was a smile on his lips, and his eyes shone with something between mischief and pure adoration. Brianna pulled him back, kissing him with an intensity that surprised them both. And in that moment, locked in that room, the outside world ceased to exist. There was only them, only truth, only this. The kiss deepened, evolving from desperate hunger into something slower, more intentional, more devastating. Thomas held Brianna's face with both hands, his thumbs caressing her cheeks, while his lips explored hers with a reverence that made her entire body tremble. It wasn't just physical desire, it was adoration. It was recognition. It was the surrender of something they'd both held back for too long. When they finally separated to breathe, they remained with their foreheads touching, ragged breaths mingling in the minimal space between them. Thomas's eyes searched hers, dark with desire, but also vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "Brianna," he whispered, and her name sounded like a prayer. "If you want to stop, if this is too far, too fast, say so now, because in a moment I won't be able to." She silenced him by placing her fingers over his lips, feeling them warm and slightly swollen from their kisses. "Don't ask me to stop. Not now, not when we're finally being honest." Something flashed in his eyes, relief mixed with an intensity that made her heart race. He captured her hand, kissing the tip of each finger slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, transforming the simple gesture into something deeply intimate. "Then let's be honest," he murmured against her palm. "Completely honest." He guided her gently until her back touched the cold wall, a delicious contrast to the heat emanating from his body. Thomas cornered her there, not with force but with presence, his arms braced on the wall on either side of her head, his large body creating a cocoon that separated her from the rest of the world. "Do you know what I thought?" he began, his voice low and hoarse. "When I saw you at that waterfall." His lips brushed her temple, descending slowly along the side of her face. "I thought I'd never seen anything so perfect, so free, so absolutely you." Brianna closed her eyes, her head tilting involuntarily to give him more access as he traced a trail of kisses along her jaw. "Thomas, and when you came out of the water," he continued, his lips now at her neck, feeling her racing pulse, "with your skin glistening, your hair wet, every curve of your body like a work of art." He nibbled lightly at the point where her neck met her shoulder, drawing a sigh from her. "I knew that image would haunt me for the rest of my life." His hands slid from the wall to her waist, his fingers finding the hem of the dress and moving slowly up her back, feeling each vertebra, each tremor that ran through her body under his touch. It wasn't rushed. It was exploration. It was discovery. It was memorization. "You're shaking," he observed, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes, concern mixing with desire. "Are you sure that—" "I'm shaking because I want you so badly I can barely breathe," she confessed, her own hands rising to unbutton the first button of his shirt, with fingers not as steady as she'd like. "I'm shaking because this is real, because you're real, and because we can finally stop pretending." His eyes closed for a second, as if her words physically touched him. When he opened them, there was something different there, less restraint, more vulnerability, as if he were allowing her to see beyond the masks he always wore. "Then don't pretend," he whispered, his hands moving up her back until they found the zipper of her dress. "Be real with me, completely real." She nodded, unable to form words as she felt the zipper descending slowly, each inch a delicious torture of anticipation. The dress loosened, sliding down her shoulders, and Thomas helped it down slowly, his eyes following each inch of revealed skin as if recording everything in his memory. When the dress fell in a heap at her feet, leaving her only in light blue lingerie, Brianna felt a wave of vulnerability, but not shame, because the way Thomas looked at her held nothing of objectification. It was reverence. It was admiration. It was as if he were seeing something sacred. "Perfect," he murmured, his hands tracing the curve of her waist, moving up her ribs, feeling each accelerated breath. Absolutely perfect. Brianna worked on the buttons of his shirt, her fingers gaining more confidence with each button released. When she finally opened the shirt completely, revealing his defined chest, muscles marked but not exaggerated, her hands spread over the warm skin, feeling his heart beating as fast as hers. "You too," she whispered, her fingers exploring the contours of his chest, descending over his tense abdomen. "Perfect." Thomas captured her hands, bringing them to his lips again before guiding them around his neck. Then, with a fluid movement, he lifted her by the waist. Brianna wrapped her legs around him instinctively, her body aligning perfectly with his, feeling every inch of desire through the thin layers of fabric that still separated them. He carried her to the conference table, sitting her carefully on the edge, positioning himself between her legs. The new position put them almost at the same height, allowing their eyes to meet on the same level, equals, vulnerable, completely present. "Brianna," he said, his hands molding her face again, forcing her to look into his eyes. "You need to understand. This isn't just a moment for me. It's not just desire, it's—" "I know," she interrupted gently, her own hands holding his wrists. "I feel the same." He closed his eyes, his forehead resting against hers. "I've never, in my entire life, never allowed myself to feel something like this. It was always work, goals, control. But you—" He opened his eyes, and the intensity there was almost painful. "You made me want more, made me want to live, not just exist." Tears finally overflowed from her eyes, rolling down her cheeks. Thomas kissed them, one at a time, savoring the salt, the raw emotion. "Don't cry," he whispered against her skin. "These are good tears," she assured him, smiling through them. "Tears of relief, of happiness, of finally allowing myself to feel what I've been denying for so long." He kissed her again, and this time the kiss had a different quality, deeper, slower, as if they had all of eternity and wanted to savor every second. His hands explored more boldly now, tracing the curve of her breasts over her bra, down her stomach, over her hips, over her thighs. Brianna arched against him, her own hands descending down his back, feeling the muscles contract under her touch. When her fingers found his belt, she hesitated only a second before beginning to unfasten it. Thomas held her hands, not to stop her, but to slow down. "We have time," he murmured against her lips. "It doesn't need to be rushed. I want to memorize every second of this, every touch, every sigh." And so he did. With a patience that was both torturous and perfect, Thomas explored every inch of her, with his hands, with his lips, with whispers of adoration that made her entire body vibrate. When he finally removed her bra, he did so with such reverence that Brianna felt more adored than exposed. "You're incredible," he whispered, his lips tracing the curve of her neck, descending. Inside and out, mind and body, strength and vulnerability. Brianna pulled him closer, eliminating any space between them, skin against skin, heat against heat. And in that moment, with the outside world temporarily forgotten, they surrendered completely. Not just to bodies, but to souls. Each touch was a promise. Each kiss was a confession. Each sigh was a surrender. When they finally united, it was with an intensity that stole both their breaths, not from physical force, but from the emotional connection that transcended the act. Thomas held her face, forcing her to keep her eyes open, to remain present, to see exactly what they were creating together. "Stay with me," he whispered, his body moving in perfect sync with hers. "Here, now, with me, always," she promised, her nails lightly marking his back, anchoring them to that moment. And as they moved together, a dance as ancient as time but new to them, Brianna knew this was more than passion. It was transformation. It was rebirth. It was love beginning to take shape in the place where only desire had existed. Afterward, lying intertwined on the cold conference room floor, clothes serving as an improvised mattress, Thomas held Brianna against his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her skin. "I never really lived," he confessed in the growing darkness, his voice laden with a vulnerability she was beginning to love. "Until now. Until you." Brianna kissed his chest, right above his strongly beating heart. "Then let's live, really live, together." "Together," he agreed. But as they remained there wrapped in each other, they both knew the real world was waiting on the other side of that door. And not everything waiting for them would be kind. The next 3 days were a carefully orchestrated lie. During the day, Brianna and Thomas were the perfect image of corporate professionalism. She presented her rebranding campaign with mastery, receiving applause from the board and approving looks, especially from Thomas, who kept his expression carefully neutral even when his eyes said otherwise. He conducted leadership workshops, participated in formal dinners, held strategic meetings as the impeccable CEO he'd always been. But at night, when the resort plunged into silence and executives retreated to their rooms, the truth emerged in the shadows. Thomas knocked on Brianna's door with a soft, specific knock she'd learned to recognize instantly, or she found him walking alone on the trail near the lake, as if chance brought them together repeatedly. And then, hidden by darkness, they allowed themselves to be real. Whispered conversations that lasted hours, stolen kisses that tasted of danger and promise, hands intertwined as if letting go meant losing something essential. "I can't stop thinking about you," Thomas confessed on one of those nights, the two of them sitting on a hidden bench behind the resort gardens, so close they breathed the same air. "During meetings, my mind should be on profit projections, but it's on you. On the way you smile when you think no one's watching, on the sound of your laugh, on the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating." Brianna rested her head on his shoulder, allowing herself that moment of vulnerability. "I can't either. It's like you woke something in me that had been asleep for years. Or maybe it never existed before you." He kissed the top of her head, his fingers intertwined with hers, with a force that bordered on desperation. "When we go back to the city, to the office, how are we going to do this?" "I don't know," she admitted, the honesty hurting more than any lie. "But I don't want to stop. I don't want to go back to pretending you mean nothing to me." "Neither do I." But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The discovery came from where they least expected, not from an observant colleague or an accidental encounter. It came from something much more modern and much more dangerous: a photo. Rachel Morrison, director of operations and Brianna's undeclared rival since both had been considered for the same promotion 2 years ago, had a habit of walking early. And that particular morning, her morning walk had taken her to exactly the wrong place at the wrong time. Or, from her point of view, the right place. Brianna was leaving Thomas's room. It was 6 in the morning, too early for most executives, but apparently not for Rachel. The hallway was empty, silent, and Brianna had checked 3 times before opening the door. Thomas stood in the doorway, still in his robe, his hair messed up in a way that made obvious what they'd been doing. "See you at breakfast," Brianna whispered, smiling at him with an intimacy that couldn't be mistaken for professionalism. Thomas held her face, kissing her one last time, a kiss that was promise and farewell at the same time. "Be careful on the way." It was exactly at that moment that the discreet flash of a cell phone captured everything. Brianna didn't notice immediately. Only when she reached her own room, closing the door with her heart still racing and her lips tingling, did she feel that chill of premonition, that primitive feeling that something was wrong. Confirmation came 2 hours later. Brianna was at breakfast, chatting animatedly with Sarah about upcoming projects, when she noticed the looks. They weren't the usual casual glances. They were specific, directed, loaded with something between curiosity, scandal, and judgment. A group of senior female executives whispered near the buffet, their eyes quickly looking away when Brianna looked in their direction. 2 department managers talked quietly, one of them discreetly pointing in her direction before shaking his head with disapproval. Brianna's stomach tightened. "What's going on?" she asked Sarah, keeping her voice casual despite her growing panic. Sarah hesitated, the discomfort obvious on her face. "Brianna, there's a rumor going around about you and—" "Well," she looked around nervously before continuing in an even lower voice, "about you and Thomas." The world tilted under Brianna's feet. "What?" "Rachel is showing a photo of you leaving his room this morning." Sarah touched her arm sympathetically. "I'm sorry, I thought you should know." The coffee Brianna had just drunk threatened to come back up. A photo. Concrete evidence. It was no longer speculation or unfounded gossip. It was undeniable proof captured in digital pixels. "Where is Rachel now?" Brianna asked, forcing her voice to remain steady even as her world crumbled. "Main conference room, with some members of the board." Of course. Rachel wasn't just spreading gossip. She was building a case. She was using this as a weapon, transforming a private moment into corporate ammunition. Brianna stood, her legs surprisingly steady considering how she felt inside. "I need to go." "Brianna, wait." Sarah tried to stop her, but she was already walking determinedly toward the meeting room. Thomas stepped out of the elevator at that exact moment, impeccable in his grey suit, his professional mask perfectly in place. But when his eyes met hers across the lobby, Brianna saw instant understanding there. He already knew. Someone had already told him. They met halfway, maintaining a respectful distance despite every fiber of their bodies screaming to touch, to comfort each other. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked quietly, his eyes scanning her face with barely disguised concern. "No," she admitted, "but I will be. We will be. Brianna, I won't let this—" "Mr. Everett." Rachel's icy voice cut through the air like a blade. She stood at the entrance to the meeting room, arms crossed, an expression of barely contained satisfaction on her face. "Good thing I found both of you. The board would like a word. With both of you." The tone was polite on the surface, but there was venom between the lines, barely disguised triumph, because Rachel finally had what she wanted, a legitimate reason to question Brianna's integrity and, by association, Thomas's judgment. Inside the meeting room, 5 board members waited. The atmosphere was cold, professional, but loaded with the promise of consequences. In the center of the table, like evidence in a courtroom, a tablet displayed the enlarged photo, Brianna leaving Thomas's room, him in the doorway in his robe, the kiss between them captured with devastating clarity. "Please sit down," instructed Margaret Chen, Director of Human Resources, her voice neutral but her eyes hard. Thomas remained standing. "I prefer to stand." "Mr. Everett, this is a serious matter that requires—" "I know exactly how serious it is," Thomas interrupted, his voice calm but loaded with authority. "And I take full responsibility." Brianna stepped forward. "No, the responsibility is both of ours. This was consensual. It was—" "A clear violation of company policies," Rachel interrupted, unable to contain the satisfaction in her voice. "Romantic relationships between superiors and subordinates are expressly prohibited, especially when they involve the CEO and an employee under his direct supervision." "Brianna is not under my direct supervision," Thomas corrected, his eyes fixed on Rachel with an intensity that would have made anyone back down. "She reports to the Director of Marketing, who reports to the COO, who reports to me. There are 3 levels of separation." "Technicalities," Rachel dismissed. "The fact remains, you're the CEO, she's an employee. This creates conflict of interest, appearance of favoritism, and potential for—" "Enough." Thomas's voice cut through the air like a whip. "I'll say this once, so listen carefully." He turned to face the entire board, his posture upright, unwavering. "Yes, Brianna Hayes and I developed a relationship that goes beyond professional. No, this has not affected any business decisions. No, she has not received preferential treatment. Every promotion, every project assigned to her was based purely on merit. Merit that anyone in this room can attest to." He paused, his gaze traveling over each face in the room. "If you have a problem with this, then the problem is with me, not with her. Brianna is one of the most talented professionals this company has ever had. Her integrity is irreproachable, and I will not allow her relationship with me to harm her career." "Thomas, don't—" Brianna began, but he silenced her with a look. "If it's necessary to choose," he continued, turning to Margaret, "between keeping my position and protecting Brianna from any unfair repercussions from this. I choose her. Always. The silence that followed was deafening. Brianna felt tears burn, but forced them to remain contained. This man, this incredible man, was willing to sacrifice everything for her. But she wasn't going to allow it. "With all due respect," Brianna said, her voice surprisingly firm, "I don't accept being protected at his expense." She turned to face the board. "Yes, we developed feelings for each other. Real feelings. And if company policies say that's impossible, then maybe I should be the one to—" "No." Thomas grabbed her arm, the first time they'd touched openly since entering the room. "You're not resigning. Not because of this." They looked at each other, an entire conversation happening in silence. Love, fear, determination, mutual protection. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. "This is complicated." Or, the calm voice of David Richardson, CFO and the board's most senior member, cut through the tension. "It's an opportunity for us to demonstrate that we're a modern company that values both healthy relationships and professional integrity." All eyes turned to him. "I've known Thomas for 15 years, David continued, and I've watched Brianna revolutionize our marketing department over the last 3 years. Both are exemplary professionals. If they chose to be together, I believe they did so with maturity and responsibility." He looked at Margaret. "We have policies about relationship disclosure. We have protocols. We can use them instead of punishing two people for being human." A heated debate followed, but the tone had changed. It was no longer about punishment. It was about solutions. When they finally left that room 2 hours later, there was an agreement. Official disclosure of the relationship. Brianna's transfer to a different department to eliminate any appearance of conflict, and a period of observation. It was a compromise. It wasn't perfect, but it was a chance. Outside the room, away from curious eyes, Thomas finally allowed his mask to fall. He pulled Brianna into an empty hallway, holding her face with both hands. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes searching hers with concern. "I'm scared," she admitted, "but I'm okay. We're going to be okay. If I could go back and change—" "I wouldn't change it," she interrupted firmly. "Not 1 second, because I love you, Thomas." The words came out before she could stop them, raw, honest, impossible to take back. His eyes widened, and for a moment he just stared at her as if he'd just heard something sacred. "Say it again," he whispered. "I love you. I love your integrity. I love your courage. I love the man you are when you let the masks fall." She smiled through the tears that finally overflowed, and it was worth it. Every consequence, every complication. "It's worth it for you." He pulled her against him, hugging her with a force that stole her breath, his face buried in her hair. "I love you too. God, I love you so much." And there, in that empty hallway, surrounded by the rubble of their carefully constructed professional lives, they chose each other. Again, and again, and again. The next 2 months tested every fiber of resilience that Brianna and Thomas possessed. The department transfer was just the beginning. Brianna was relocated to product development, a lateral move that in theory maintained her salary level and responsibilities, but in practice placed her under the relentless scrutiny of colleagues who saw her as the one who slept her way to the top. An unfair but persistent narrative that Rachel Morrison fed at every opportunity. The looks in the hallways changed. Before, Brianna was recognized for her innovative campaigns, for her natural leadership, for measurable results that no one could question. Now, every success came accompanied by whispers. "Of course, she's with the CEO." Every important project she received was analyzed not for its merit, but for who she knew intimately. It was exhausting, humiliating, unfair. But Brianna didn't give up. She couldn't. Because giving up would mean confirming every accusation, validating every malicious whisper. And, more importantly, it would mean that those who wanted to separate her from Thomas had won. Thomas, for his part, fought his own battle. The board of directors, although they'd allowed the relationship under strict conditions, watched his every move with a magnifying glass. Every decision was questioned. Every meeting where Brianna was present, even when professionally necessary, was dissected for signs of favoritism. I can't even look at you during meetings, Thomas confessed one night, the two of them hidden in his apartment away from corporate eyes. He stood on the balcony, his hands gripping the railing hard enough to make his knuckles white. I'm so conscious of every gesture, every word, that I can barely concentrate on the content. And when you speak, when you present those brilliant ideas you've always had, I have to force my expression to be neutral, because smiling would be interpreted as favoritism. Brianna approached, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her face against his back. I know. It's hard for me too, but we're doing this. We're surviving. Surviving isn't enough, he said, turning to face her, his face marked by an exhaustion that went beyond physical. You deserve to thrive. You deserve to be recognized for your talent without people questioning how you got there. And I will be. With time, they'll see. They'll have to see. But time seemed to work against them. The summons came on a cold Monday in November. Margaret Chen requested separate meetings, first with Thomas, then with Brianna. The formal tone of the email set off immediate alarms. Thomas entered the board meeting room with his spine straight, prepared for war. Margaret was there, along with David Richardson and 3 other board members. The atmosphere was icy. Thomas, please sit down, Margaret began, her voice carefully neutral. I prefer to stand. This will be easier if... Nothing about this situation has been easy, Margaret. So let's get to the point. She sighed, exchanging glances with the other members. Very well. We've received concerns from several departments about the appearance of ongoing conflict of interest between you and Ms. Hayes. Appearance, Thomas repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Not actual conflict, because there is no actual conflict. Brianna is no longer under my supervision, doesn't participate in decisions that directly affect her, and every performance metric of hers is reviewed by multiple people before reaching my desk. Technically true, David agreed. But Thomas, you have to understand, perception matters, and the current perception is affecting company morale. Other employees feel that access to you has become unequal. Unequal how? Thomas challenged. My door has always been open to any employee with valid ideas. That hasn't changed. But trust has changed, Margaret said softly. People question whether your decisions are impartial, and this is creating divisions that a company this size cannot sustain. Thomas felt the ground begin to crumble beneath his feet. He knew where this was going. What are you proposing? A choice, Margaret said, and there was genuine sadness in her eyes. You can keep your relationship with Brianna, but in that case, we would need one of you to leave the company, or you can agree to end the relationship, formally documented, and both can keep your positions. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stared at them, incredulous. You're asking me to choose between the woman I love and the company I built. We're asking you to do what's best for everyone involved, David said, but even he looked uncomfortable. Best for everyone? Thomas let out a humorless laugh. Or best for people like Rachel Morrison, who are using this as a political weapon. Rachel isn't on the board, Thomas. No, but she's poisoning the company culture, turning a genuine relationship into scandal for her own advancement. He leaned over the table, fixing each of them with an intense look. And you're allowing it. Thomas, no. He straightened, the decision already made. I won't choose, I won't discard an incredible woman to appease gossips, and I won't ask her to sacrifice the career she's worked so hard to build. Then what do you propose? Margaret asked. That you do what needs to be done. If my presence as CEO is causing so much trouble because I dared to be human, because I dared to love someone, then maybe it's time for me to leave. The room exploded in protests. But Thomas was already leaving, the door closing behind him with finality. An hour later, it was Brianna's turn to enter that same room. She already knew. Thomas had called, his voice tense, telling her everything. But even prepared, feeling the reality of that ultimatum weighed like lead in her chest. Ms. Hayes, Margaret began, gentler this time, I imagine Thomas has already informed you about the situation. He has, Brianna confirmed, keeping her voice steady, even as her world crumbled. And I'm here to say I won't allow him to resign because of me. Brianna, I resign. The words came out clear, decisive, rehearsed on the way there. Effective immediately. You don't need to do this, David said. There are other options. Perhaps a transfer to our international branch where the dynamics would be different. No. Brianna shook her head. I won't run away. And I won't hide my relationship as if it was something shameful. Thomas built this company from scratch. He gave 15 years of his life to it. I won't be the reason he loses that. And if he doesn't agree with your decision? Brianna smiled, sad but determined. Then we'll have our first real fight, but he'll understand. Eventually. But when Brianna arrived at Thomas's apartment that night, she found him not defeated, but furious. A cold, calculated fury she recognized as dangerous. No, was the first word he said when he saw her. I don't accept your resignation. I won't let you sacrifice your career. And I won't let you sacrifice yours, she shot back, closing the door behind her. Brianna, Thomas, listen. You built this company. You have responsibilities to hundreds of employees, to shareholders, to you, he interrupted her, walking to her and holding her face with an intensity that stole her breath. My responsibility is to you, because you're my future, not that company. The tears Brianna had been holding since the meeting finally overflowed. You can't just throw away everything you've built. I'm not throwing it away. I'm choosing. There's a difference. He pressed his forehead to hers, breaths mingling. If the company I built doesn't have room for love, for humanity, for real people to have real relationships, then it's not the company I want to lead. Thomas, let me finish. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. I spent my entire life building walls, focusing on goals, on numbers, on measurable success. And yes, I built something impressive, but it was empty. I was alone. Until you. He held her hands, intertwining their fingers. You showed me what it really means to live, what it means to feel, what it means to wake up and have something, someone who matters more than any quarterly report. And I won't give that up. Not for a company, not for anything. Brianna sobbed, allowing herself to fall against his chest. But what are we going to do? We're going to fight. He wrapped his arms around her, squeezing with a protective force. Together. We'll go back tomorrow and face that board not as individuals begging for approval, but as partners demanding respect. And if it doesn't work, then we'll build something new. Together. He kissed the top of her head. Because in the end, if I have to choose between you and power, I choose you. Always. And that night, embraced in the darkness, they made a silent pact. No matter what tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Because true love wasn't about sacrificing one for the other. It was about fighting side by side. The next morning's meeting was unlike any the boardroom had ever witnessed. Thomas entered first, not with the posture of a cornered man, but with the confidence of someone who had finally found absolute clarity. Brianna entered right behind him, and for the first time since the scandal had exploded, they didn't try to hide the connection between them. They walked side by side, presented themselves together, sat together. The message was clear. This was no longer territory for negotiation about individual aspects. Either they accepted both or they'd lose both. Margaret Chen opened her mouth to speak, but Thomas raised his hand, silencing her gently but firmly. Before you say anything, he began, his voice calm but loaded with undeniable authority, Brianna and I have something to declare, and after we declare it, you can make your decisions with all the information on the table. He looked at Brianna, a look that communicated support and love, then turned back to the board. Brianna Hayes is the most competent, ethical, and brilliant woman this company has ever been lucky enough to employ. Every achievement of hers, and there have been many, was reached through hard work, strategic vision, and undeniable talent. Our relationship hasn't changed that. If anything, it's only made me admire her more, because I've seen the strength she has, not just as a professional, but as a person. He paused, letting the words settle. I love her. I love her completely, deeply, in a way I won't hide or diminish for anyone's comfort. And if this company, the company I dedicated 15 years of my life to building, can't accept that its CEO is human enough to love, then maybe it's no longer the company I thought I'd created. Brianna touched his hand under the table, a silent source of strength. But, Thomas continued, straightening, I'm not here to make threats. I'm here to propose a solution, one that's fair to everyone, To the company, to the employees, and to us. Margaret leaned forward, finally interested. We're listening. I keep my position as CEO for 6 more months, Thomas outlined, each word carefully chosen. Enough time for a proper transition to train my successor to ensure the company continues to prosper. During that period, Brianna remains in her current department, with performance evaluations conducted by an independent committee to eliminate any appearance of favoritism. He looked at each board member individually. After those 6 months, I leave the company. Not under scandal, not under pressure, but as a conscious decision to pursue new challenges. And Brianna? He smiled at her, a smile that lit up his eyes in a way rarely seen in boardrooms. Brianna will be evaluated purely on her merit. If she deserves promotion, promote her. If she deserves recognition, recognize her, without any connection to me obscuring her talents. The silence that followed was heavy with consideration. David Richardson was the first to speak. It's a reasonable proposal, fair even. But 6 months is little time for CEO transition, Margaret argued, though her tone suggested she was looking for solutions, not obstacles. Then make it 8, Thomas offered, but no more than that, because my priority, after that period, will be building a life with the woman I love, and that life can no longer revolve around boardrooms and quarterly reports. More discussions followed. Details were negotiated. Terms were adjusted. But in the end, 3 hours later, there was an agreement. Thomas would lead the transition, Brianna would be re-evaluated by an independent committee, and in 8 months, both would be free to live their lives without the crushing weight of corporate judgment. When they left that room for the first time in months, they breathed without the overwhelming weight of uncertainty. "Are you really going to leave everything?" Brianna asked as they walked down the hallway, maintaining respectful distance but their eyes saying everything. "I'm not leaving everything," Thomas corrected gently. "I'm choosing everything that really matters." 6 months later. The transition months were intense but liberating. Thomas worked tirelessly to prepare his successor, ensuring every system, every relationship, every strategy was solidly established. Brianna, free from direct scrutiny, flourished in her department. Her campaigns for product development broke engagement records, and even the harshest critics had to admit her undeniable value. Rachel Morrison, ironically, ended up being transferred to the international branch after an audit revealed irregularities in her own projects. Justice, it seemed, had a sense of timing. And when Thomas's last day at the company finally arrived, there was no bitterness, only gratitude for what had been built and excitement for what was to come. But Thomas had one last act planned. He asked Brianna to meet him at a specific place on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after his official departure. He didn't say where, just sent GPS coordinates and a message, "Trust me." Brianna followed the coordinates until she recognized the path. She was back at the mountain resort. More specifically, she was being guided back to the trail that led to the waterfall. Her heart began to beat faster. When she finally reached the clearing, the sun was high, bathing everything in golden light. The waterfall continued its eternal song, indifferent to how much had changed since the last time she'd been there. And Thomas was there, in the same place where he'd stood on that fateful day, but this time without surprise or accident. This time, with intention. He wore jeans and a simple shirt, far from the impeccable suits he'd always worn. He looked younger, lighter, more free. "You brought me back," Brianna said, approaching slowly, a smile growing on her face. "I did, because this is where everything changed. This is where I saw you, really saw you for the first time. Free, brave, absolutely perfect." He extended his hand, and she took it, letting him pull her close. "And it was here," he continued, his voice becoming softer, more intimate, "that I realized I wanted to spend the rest of my life seeing you like this. Not hidden behind corporate walls or other people's expectations, but free, true, yourself." Brianna felt tears begin to form as he slowly knelt in front of her, still holding her hands. "Brianna Hayes," he said, his eyes shining with raw emotion, "you freed me from a life I didn't know was a prison. You showed me what it means to really live, really feel, really love. And now, in this place where it all began, I want to promise you something." He released one of her hands to take a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple but stunning ring, an emerald surrounded by diamonds, reflecting the sunlight like the waterfall's water itself. "I promise to love you every day for the rest of my life. I promise to support you in every dream, every challenge, every moment. I promise never to ask you to be less than you are to fit other people's expectations. And I promise," he smiled, that smile that melted her heart, "to make you feel as free as you felt that day, coming out of that water." Tears now ran freely down Brianna's face. "Brianna Hayes, will you break all the rules with me for the rest of our lives? Will you build something new, something ours, something that doesn't need anyone's approval but our own?" "Yes," she sobbed, pulling him up and throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, 1,000 times yes, but only if it's hand in hand. Always hand in hand." He spun her around, laughing loudly, a genuine free laugh that echoed through the clearing. When he set her back down, he slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her with an intensity that contained all the promises they'd made, all the battles they'd fought, and all the future they would now build together. 3 months later, the company's year-end party was a grand event, as always. Brianna attended now as Director of Product Innovation, a promotion she'd earned through indisputable merit, evaluated by a committee that didn't even know her history with Thomas. Thomas was there too, not as CEO, but as a special guest. He'd started his own consulting firm, helping startups build more human, more ethical corporate cultures. And he was thriving. But most importantly, he was happy. They were dancing now, in the center of the ballroom, not caring about the looks. The music was soft, intimate, and they moved together as if no one else existed. "Happy?" Thomas asked, his lips near her ear. "Completely," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. Some younger colleagues watched with curiosity. One of them, a recent hire, asked Sarah, "What's their story? They seem so connected." Sarah smiled, that smile of someone who knew secrets worth keeping. "It's a long story," she said, watching the couple in the center of the floor. "About a waterfall, difficult choices, and love that refused to be silenced." "Tell me," the young man insisted, fascinated. Sarah looked at Brianna and Thomas, seeing not just executives or former employees, but two people who had risked everything for true love, and won. "Let me tell you," she began, "about the day she came out of the waterfall naked, thinking she was alone, but froze when she saw her boss." And as the story unfolded again, this time as legend within that company, Brianna and Thomas continued dancing. Free. Together. Forever. In the end, what Brianna and Thomas discovered wasn't just love. It was courage. Courage to challenge systems that tried to define who they could be. Courage to choose truth over convenience. Courage to believe that some things, some people, are worth every battle, every sacrifice, every moment of uncertainty. Because true love doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't hide. It doesn't shrink itself to fit into corporate boxes or social expectations. True love simply is. And when we find it, when we finally touch that rare spark that illuminates everything, we have only one real choice: protect it with everything we are. Thomas left power behind. Brianna faced judgment. And together, they built something no boardroom could contain, a life lived on their own terms. Maybe true freedom isn't about never facing consequences, but about choosing which battles are worth fighting, and then fighting with everything you have. And you? Have you found something or someone for whom it would be worth breaking all the rules? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was truly worth listening to, also click the Super Thanks button. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you.